Hey there, welcome to the Stream Home Edition. I am Josh Rushing, sitting in for Femi OK. If you're watching this on YouTube, help me out. You're going to join the conversation. Let me show you. See that box right there? That's a live chat. I know people have been waiting to get in it already because this topic today is really hot. We have a stream producer in that chat waiting to get your comments and your questions to me so that I can get them to the guests. So help me out. Get your comments and questions in there. In fact, we already have some comments, and I'm going to go to one right now. Milan S says, I was in a psilocybin case study, did wonders and should be something for everyone to consume in the right setting and environment. Can't wait for the stream. Interested to hear what people have to say. So there are these studies going on. I haven't even told you what the topic is yet. We're talking about psilocybin today. We're talking about magic mushrooms today. We're going to talk about them in a therapy setting, some of the studies that are finally going on. They were blocked for a long time, but they're finally going on, and the therapeutic value of it. Then we're going to move beyond the therapeutic value of it. We're going to talk about the possibilities that magic mushrooms have. And then we're going to talk about a movement that's happening across the US right now where it's being decriminalized. It's already happened in Denver, Oakland, and this fall in Washington, D.C., citizens, residents will have a chance to vote on whether to decriminalize it in the capital of the country. Super exciting to talk about it. I'm joined by an exciting panel of guests, but before that, I'm even going to bring in our Twitter crowd here. Check this out, guys. We posted this out on Twitter with some questions. Here are some responses we got. Earth Dog 58, I'm willing to give it a go. Sign me up. All right, Earth Dog. Christian Carterelli, I'm mispronouncing that. The consumption of such mushrooms is dangerous, even in the presence of experts. To recognize a crisis in the consumption does not mean to be able to prevent it. So a word of warning there. We'll discuss that today. And then here is someone that no LSD, got a Palestinian flag there, I think, right? Got to go with perhaps on this one. Fact is, it's far easier to control dosage with pharmaceutical grade hallucinogenics, which is pretty key. My understanding is there's a higher incidence of bad trips from mushrooms versus other candidates. We need to look at real user data. Okay, great. This will come up in the conversation. I'm going to get right to our guest. Hey, guys, thanks for joining me here on this stream today. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Ismail, can we begin with you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation to be on the show. My name is Ismail Lodido Ali, and I work as Policy and Advocacy Counsel at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also known as MAPS.
And you're joining us from Oakland, where they've already decriminalized. So we're going to talk about that
Indeed.
Here in a minute. Moving up to Danielle, who's in San Francisco at the moment.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Danielle Marie Herrera. I work as a harm reduction therapist at a harm reduction therapy center in San Francisco, as well as a psychedelic psychotherapist with Sage Institute in Oakland.
And then down to Michelle in Chiapas.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm a journalist focused on psychedelics, education, policy, and I'm also the author of Your Psilocybin Mushroom Companion.
Great. Let me bring in a voice from our community. This is a video from an Oxford researcher named Eddie Jacobs. Can we play this, guys?
In the last 10 years, we've had clinical trials of psilocybin for depression, anxiety, OCD, and addiction. Each of these clinical trials has shown that not only is psilocybin an incredibly safe compound to administer in clinical contexts, it's also potentially very effective at treating these conditions. But despite the safety of psilocybin, despite the promise that it holds for helping hundreds of millions of people worldwide, it remains incredibly difficult to do this research because of outdated, needlessly restrictive regulations governing psilocybin. Regardless of where you stand on the wider conversation about decriminalisation, about personal recreational use, if you're in favour of supporting mental health treatments, you should be in favour of making it easier for scientists to do this research.
Mm-hmm.
Danielle, can you talk to me about the use of hallucinogenics in therapy and how, what that's been like for you?
Yeah, where I'm at right now, we're not obviously using them within the therapeutic context because of legalization, but the research is very strong and powerful, and I do think there's a good reason for the complications in legalization in regards to that this is sacred medicine that we're utilizing for very serious mental health concerns that requires landing in honoring the spiritual practices and honoring the the traditional indigenous methods of shamanic healing that we're incorporating into something more Western in regards to therapy. So when I talk anecdotally to people who have been lucky enough to have had access to these methods for healing, it has been, really life-changing for them. Of course, I have connections too with the underground, with folks who are working with these medicines in non-research based settings and are experiencing similarly really life-changing experiences where they are being lifted from years of depression, from complicated, chaotic relationships with other substances, difficulties with obsessive compulsive disorder, and really long-term intergenerational traumas. It's beautiful work.
So Ismail, she's saying that it's difficult to use this in a therapeutic setting. I thought under certain conditions that was legal now. That's not the case?
So right now, and it's helpful here to differentiate between psilocybin and magic mushrooms. Psilocybin is the active ingredient in what we call magic mushrooms. And when you're thinking about the FDA trials or the clinical research, they're usually talking about synthetics or extracted psilocybin in its pure form versus magic mushrooms, which is the mushrooms that grow in the field or the forest. And the big difference to really think about there is that the actual trials themselves are working toward FDA approval, which would create legal access in a medical context. But what we're seeing in the trends for decriminalization, which maybe we'll talk about a bit more later, they're usually focusing on the plant itself, or the fungus in this case itself. And at this time, there are a couple places in the US where has been decriminalized, or the penalties have been reduced, but there really isn't anywhere in the US where you can legally consume it yet, unless you're in the clinical trials like we were talking about.
So some of those clinical trials might be like what's happening at Johns Hopkins or the VA. That's right. What's the timeline on those? At what point can we see that becoming easier for someone like Danielle to have access to in the therapeutic setting?
Realistically, my understanding is that the timeline is probably about 2023, 2024. So MDMA, which is another psychedelic substance that's also going through clinical trials, is expected to be approved in about 2022, in about 2 years from now. And that seems to be the case that psilocybin is about a year behind that.
Michelle, what led you to covering psychedelics as a journalist?
Well, I've been a psychedelic consumer since I was a teenager. And when I first started, I didn't have access to a lot of safe use info. And I did some kind of stupid things, taking things like mushrooms and LSD in unsupervised settings. And so I did a lot of research, and I found out that there actually is decades and centuries, if you consider also indigenous practices, of safe and sacred uses. And so I wanted to compile them all into a book that was, really accessible and easy to read, so people could learn about how to use these things safely. Because outside of clinical trials, there's a lot of people using mushrooms and other psychedelics for healing on their own, and there's a lot of progress being made. And so I really wanted to give people all the safe use info they could possibly need to do this work.
So look, I want to guide our viewers to Twitter, where Paul Stamets, and if you don't know Paul Stamets, he lives up in the Northwest, and he's kind of the godfather of mushrooms in some ways. He's definitely an evangelist for mushrooms, not just in the psychedelic sense, but how they can help remedy the planet through environmental ways and like all sorts of stuff. He's a fascinating guy. He has a couple of TED Talks. They have millions of views. I have a couple of his books. So on Twitter, he recently posted, "Yesterday I turned 65 years of age, a time in life for deep reflection." And then I want to play this video for you.
There's two things certain in life. We are born and we die. Where did we come from? Where are we going? With the psilocybin mushroom experience, you suddenly know that you're part of a giant oneness. And it gives you context and consolation about your own mortality. So I think it's critically important that at the end of your life, you have a right to these substances. Who dares say that you do not? When these have been used for thousands, probably tens of thousands, maybe millions of years, and laws have been created to ostracize people to use them only in the past 50 years? I mean, it's not only academically naive, it's immoral. And I think that everyone has a right to how they're going to leave this life.
Look, I'm just going to say I'm an unabashed fan of Paul's, but I'm going to disagree with him really fundamentally here. He says that there are two things that are true in life, that you're born and you die. I say there's a third thing that's true, is that you don't know when you're going to die. Like no one does. You don't know when. And so for him to say that, who dares keep this from us at our end of life because he's 65, I don't know if I'm going to make it to 65. Danielle, why do I need to wait until I'm 65 to access what he's talking about, this kind of understanding about life?
Yeah, I love that question. Also, happy belated birthday, Paul Stamets. So yeah, I often think of like utilizing psychedelics, particularly the plant medicines, as a way of practicing death. So that's another way in which I would almost disagree with Paul Stamets, right? You're born and you die, and you can also have this experience similarly to meditation. The psychedelic experience is one of practicing death, and in that you're gaining all of the insight that comes from that wisdom. And yeah, I think these medicines should be accessible. And, similar to what Michelle was saying, with access, we need access to harm reduction information, to information that's going to allow a container to be set so that both our environment is a container that can allow for the deepest spiritual and healing practice available when we utilize these medicines, as well as a perspective that will allow you to ground into a mindset that offers you the most potential. So I totally agree. We should have access, and people are going to be doing it anyways. It's the same thing as sex education, right? Abstinence only doesn't work. We're all using drugs. We might as well have access to the information that's going to maximize our benefits.
And
I've
from
neglected our YouTube community here, where the comments are coming faster than I can get them in. Hold on, Ismail. Let me get a couple of these guys' comments in, and then we'll go right to you. Hold that thought. Let me see. Kiefer Kaufman says, what are the specific aspects of psilocybin that make one so self-reflective and bring the sort of inner peace that statement asserts? I love that question. Ismail, pick up where you were going to go, and then maybe you can riff into this.
Yeah, I was just going to say that from a practical perspective, to the point that Danielle was making about containers, it seems like what's happening with Western psychotherapy and medicine as it relates to psychedelic experiences specifically is that we're trying to find the right containers. So these substances have been used for hundreds, thousands of years, and they weren't just used haphazardly in the most random context per se. Usually they were utilized through rites of passage or initiations or ceremonies, context within which there was a container where the experience was happening. So I think what's occurring is that we're merging these ancient shamanic practices with the Western psychotherapeutic container, and we're trying to figure out, well, how do we contain this healing or this experience, typically within the context of medicine today? And that's really the exploration that's happening now. And I think as far as the effects go, that question really depends on the person. Some people will give you a very biological answer. Some people will give you a very spiritual or psychological answer. I think that it's probably a combination of factors. And to Danielle's point, this idea of how we approach and relate to death, I think that that's something that happens at multiple levels of consciousness at the same time. So it's hard to point to like a single reason why they're having the effects that we're looking at.
But talking about the effects, Michelle, can you talk to us about the effects? Since you said you have been a user, and also I'd like to transition to start talking about microdosing, taking small amounts each day that are not hallucinogenic, but do people claim have a positive effect? Can you touch on that, Michelle?
Yeah, sure. I think honestly that both microdoses and larger macro doses, in the low to moderate dose range, are having a lot of effects, positive effects for a lot of people. And, to speak to Ismail's point about containers, I think a lot of folks who use psychedelics at home, without some kind of therapist, they're creating their own containers. They're giving this a lot of thought. They're maybe making their own ceremonies or rituals and routines to put their mindset into one where they want insights and perspective shift. And that is something that psychedelics can give us. And that's a way to better the well as well. And I think microdosing can do this to an extent. People feel a bit more open and connected on microdose days and a lot of other things. And it's just helping them be the best version of themselves they can be, whether or not they have clinical depression or anxiety or not. I think that a lot of folks are finding a lot of benefits regardless.
Hey, I have another video from someone in our community. This is Paul Austin, and he is the, I think, founder and CEO of Third Wave. Check this out.
Microdosers in Silicon Valley are becoming involved in the decriminalization and legalization of movement of psilocybin in 3 ways. One is by donating to nonprofits, in particular the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, who then donates money to MAPS, Hefter, and CIIS. The second way is by starting for-profit ventures. There's tons of companies that are popping up in the for-profit space for psychedelics who are raising investment to get psilocybin approved as a medicine for depression, addiction, and a various number of other conditions. And the third way is just storytelling, people telling their personal stories of how microdosing has helped them. The time is now to destigmatize these substances, and storytelling is a critical element of that process.
Danielle, can you talk about that? I know microdosing kind of has this bit of a bad rep for being a Silicon bro thing, but it goes way beyond that, right? Can you talk a little bit about microdosing?
Yeah, a little bit I would like to say about microdosing is that, one of the things I think that's being offered here that isn't otherwise talked about is that what we're really doing is allowing the relationship of reciprocity to happen between us and plant medicines. So that alone is something that I think is really valuable when somebody decides to microdose something like psilocybin, is that we are allowing the new perspective of I am connected to something bigger than myself, and over time that element is adding up into our body, and we feel more connected to something bigger than us. And when that bigger than us thing comes in, we are opening up to larger spiritual practices that aren't really a part of like traditional Western medicine, that can then stimulate new forms of just really a new set of eyes. That's what I would say about microdosing.
So the problem with microdosing right now is it's illegal, except in very few places in the U.S., which have decriminalized. I know, Ismail, that you're in Oakland. They decriminalized there, I believe, right? And in Denver, they're going to vote on it this year in Washington, D.C. What are some of the counter arguments against decriminalization, and have those come to fruition in Oakland? What's been the fallout of decriminalization there?
Totally. I'll start maybe by clarifying some terms here, because what actually happened in Denver and Oakland and Santa Cruz was a deprioritization, which essentially meant local law enforcement would not spend resources enforcing laws related to psilocybin or other plant medicines. It's specifically psilocybin in Denver and other plant medicines, including psilocybin in places like Oakland and Santa Cruz. And I think the move toward reducing or eliminating criminal penalties, specifically to supposedly shift the actual calculus that might occur when it comes to a person's risk when they're taking a substance, has been for a very long time seen as a move toward an overly free society that could lead to people kind of doing mushrooms all the time or doing them in a container in a context that's unsafe. I think that there are very real concerns about the utilization of substances like mushrooms at all times, like we've been talking about today. But a lot of the fears around kind of increased arrests or increased kind of law enforcement attention, I think maybe has not been the case so far. And I do think that as we start to see other cities start to decriminalize and reduce the criminal penalties around it, we'll start to see that especially for substances like mushrooms, but this is probably true to some extent for all drugs, reducing criminalization actually reduces the risk on the person. The reality is that prohibition and criminalization increases the risk. We know now, because of the research that's been done, that psilocybin as a substance is extremely safe for the physical body, but it becomes much more dangerous when by taking it, what you're doing is risking incarceration. That's really the harm that I think people are most afraid of. And for good reason. That's really, I think, I believe that it's likely that more people probably have secondary effects, negative effects from criminalization itself than from the microdose or from the mushroom experience.
Yeah, Baron Aaron in our YouTube audience says legalization of any illegal drug brings safer usage and dosage, plus the pharmaceutical industry must regulate the ingredients so it can't be cut with dangerous unknown additives. What I wonder on kind of a philosophical level is at what point in the social contract did I give up my right to walk through an old growth forest and eat whatever I want to eat? Like, Who said that they could
Totally.
create a law about that?
Totally. I mean, the reality is that mushrooms and other psychedelic substances were all criminalized kind of in a series over the course of the late 60s and kind of culminating with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which is the current scheme that controls drug regulation and specifically illegal drug criminalization in the United States. So it was kind of pulled into this wave of anti-drug sentiment in the 60s and 70s that was directed primarily at Black people, Mexican people, and hippies. The anti-war movement was using psychedelics, as we know, and that's a huge part of what kind of was put it into this category of dangerous drugs, even though the research at the time was very limited and didn't actually show the dangers. And now we can see years later that the research is in fact showing that the policy in the first place was not based on evidence of harm. It was actually based on political considerations. And those are kind of the things that we're unweaving now. So we're seeing the research improve some of these considerations and stigma, but it's definitely beyond the research too.
Hey, Michelle, looked like you wanted to jump in on that one too.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, these laws weren't based on science, right? And I think that one of the things that these laws and the risk that taking psychedelics and it being illegal, it also affects your mindset going into the experience. And so a lot of people talk about, oh, mushrooms are bad because you could have a bad trip and it's really scary and all this stuff. But honestly, if the decriminalization and destigmatization movement keeps moving forward, then, I think people will have less of these fears in their head going into the experience, and therefore they could have, better, more beneficial experiences when they're actually on mushrooms, and that can help them if they integrate it correctly and keep processing it to be more fulfilled, happier, more productive, all these things we talk about. People.
We have another comment from our community. This is from Kyle Bowler from Psychedelics Today. Let's hear what he has to say.
Places like Denver, Colorado have decriminalized psilocybin containing mushrooms, and places like Oakland and Santa Cruz, California have decriminalized all plant medicines such as ayahuasca and psilocybin. I think this is a decision in the right direction for drug policy. I don't think people should be getting arrested for consuming these substances. They can be very powerful and there's definitely risks, but I think we can do a better job at harm reduction and education. People have been finding healing, developing or deepening their spirituality through these substances, and I support cognitive liberty. So if people want to explore their minds in a safe way, I'm all for that.
Hey, Ismail, just so as a warning here, we're coming up toward the end of the show, so we don't have long left, but can you give us an outlook on what's going to happen this fall? I know that people in DC are going to get to vote on, I believe, decriminalizing this. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe it's deprioritizing it. But is it on the ballot anywhere else? Is this following the pathway that cannabis set politically? Can you touch on those things?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. So with respect to the local efforts, the deprioritization or decriminalization means that in those cities, there's no enforcement about these laws. But the states can still enforce criminal law, and the laws around psilocybin are not necessarily changing at the state level or haven't yet. So in DC is voting on a similar measure to what passed in Oregon and Santa Cruz to deprioritize or decriminalize the plants themselves. But there is actually a vote happening in Oregon, an initiative, IP 34, I believe, which would be legalizing psilocybin services. It's interesting because IP 34 does not decriminalize psilocybin itself. It only legalizes and regulates psilocybin services for use. And that's closer to what we see with cannabis today. So today we have both a medical and legal schemes for adult use. What's emerging at the state level for psilocybin is closer to adult use with a few additional barriers for safety and considerations around that.
Hey, real quick here, I got about 30 seconds. Where can people go to find out more information about exactly that?
You can check out Decriminalize Nature, and you can also check out the Psilocybin Services Initiative in Oregon.
Excellent. Hey, I want to thank you, Ismail, Michelle, and Danielle. I want to thank everyone for being here today. Exciting subject. I promise you guys, this is going to be the fastest 25 minutes of your life. I think it ended up that way. What a great show. Thank you.